Welcome back to another AP US History video lecture. This time we have a lot of ground to cover because we're going to be talking about what led up to the Great Depression. In order to do that, we're going to go all the way back to World War I, when the United States got in 1917. So, what can we say about this period that's known as the Roaring Twenties leading up to the Great Depression? Well, first of all, the reason why we call it the Roaring Twenties is not just because of one reason. There are multiple reasons. One is technological. We're going to see that there were a whole bunch of new technologies that caused the economy to go boom. Also, there were major cultural changes. So as the economy was going well, there was a fight that took place between two major philosophies called modernism and traditionalism. And then, at the very end of all this, in 1928, we see a collapse, both of the economy and a challenging to all these cultural changes that took place. So why did this happen? Well, here's my overall thesis. The Roaring Twenties was really based upon some unstable financial techniques, and these techniques allowed for growth, but it was due to huge amounts of debt and what we call speculation, especially on the stock market. This also led to changes in roles for a variety of different people, including African Americans, Latinos, and women. Okay, let's start off though in 1917 with the entry into World War I. Here we're going to go back a little bit further. In 1914, Woodrow Wilson ran on a position that we were not going to get into World War I. He ran the position of neutrality. It probably sounds familiar, going all the way back to that tradition with George Washington. Well, this changed very quickly, and it was due to several incidents. The Germans at the time period developed a new type of warfare called U-boat warfare. U-boat warfare was very similar to submarine warfare, although at the beginning, U-boats really they would sit on the top of the water and they were just used to ram ships. But eventually, they were able to submerge underneath water. In about 1916, the Germans started doing this complete warfare of using U-boats to sink civilian luxury liners. Like, for example, the most famous is one called the Lusitania, in which over 100 Americans who were on board were killed. Now, the interesting thing about that, the British were being blockaded, so the British came up with a strategy. They would hide ammunitions on luxury liners. The Germans found out about this, and they began attacking these luxury liners. But no matter what, Woodrow Wilson saw this and warned the Germans not to do this again. We still did not get involved in World War I. The point when we did was when a note was intercepted, called the Zimmermann Note, in which the ambassador for the Germans, a man named Zimmermann, made the argument to the Mexicans that if they entered into the war against the Americans and kept us out of World War I, that when the Germans won, they would give back all the lands the Mexicans lost in the Mexican-American War. Well, that was it. We entered into the war in 1917, and because when we entered in, we were this new force that was not really disillusioned by World War I, we helped to end the war pretty quickly. So by 1919, the war was over. Now, during the war, there were some interesting things that happened to the presidency that we need to remember. First off, Wilson expanded the power of the presidency. He established several commissions, probably the most famous being under a man named George Creel, who worked for Hollywood. He was under the Committee on Public Information, in which they worked with Hollywood to put out a ton of propaganda against the Germans. Another good example that Woodrow Wilson did was something called the Espionage and Sedition Acts, in which anybody who spoke out against the war could be put in prison. And eventually there was a case that was brought before the Supreme Court over this issue called Shank versus U.S., in which the Supreme Court argued that during world wars, or during any type of war, it was possible for certain rights to get curtailed. Also, Woodrow Wilson was able to get past a Selective Service Act, which basically mandated people over a certain age in order to be drafted into the military. And Wilson also worked with unions to avoid strikes at the time. So all of this really expanded the power of the presidency. It's going to be important in the long term for what we call the imperial presidency. Now, the war was very disillusioning for Europeans because of trench warfare and because of new weapons like the Maxim gun and poison gas. However, for Americans, we didn't really see that because we were all the way across the Atlantic. So at the end of the war, Woodrow Wilson was hailed as a hero, and he called for something called the 14 Points. So what is this? Well, it's kind of known in foreign policy as Wilsonian moralism. He called for certain principles that would guide the global order from here on out. These principles included things like the open seas. This was an attack on submarine warfare. Free trade, the idea that if we could trade with one another, it would end warfare in the future. Open diplomacy. Well, how are we going to do open diplomacy? He called for an international organization called the League of Nations. It would be based upon something known as collective security. If anybody stepped out of line, the League of Nations would force them back into it. He also called for the freedom of colonies, or sovereignty. He argued that this was kind of the cause of World War I, so we should stop Europeans from having these colonies. Now, actually what he meant by that was colonies within Central and Southern Europe, not outside of that. Henry Cabot Lodge, one of the senators at the time, opposed us getting into the League of Nations based upon our national sovereignty. Wilson campaigned across the country, but eventually suffered a stroke. And after that happened, Henry Cabot Lodge was able to win a huge concession in which he said, we'll enter the League of Nations if we get what's called Article 10. That was the U.S. would only accept the League of Nations if they had the right to reject the League of Nations statements. Well, Wilson said, then what's the point of having it? And then he campaigned against the League of Nations. Okay, when World War I ended, the economy took a huge boom, and all of a sudden, we left the progressive era. Because now all of a sudden, people thought they were benefiting by this enormous economic boom. Why did this happen? Well, there were new technologies like the radio. Movies came out, especially what were called talkies. This was where you could have a moving picture along with sound that would be played at the same time. New household appliances and the Model T car. Also, new financial tools were being used to pay for all this. Something called the installment payment. This is sort of like a credit card, not exactly. Imagine you go in to buy a couch and the couch costs you $100. Instead of paying up front $100, you pay in $25 installments with some interest. And also something called buying on the margin. Okay, this one's a tough one. Buying on the margin was used in the stock market. Basically what it meant was you would buy on the margin. If a share of stock cost $100, you'd put down $10 and borrow the other $90. And the idea was the stock market goes up, you cash in, you easily pay off what you loaned, what you borrowed, and on top of that you make a good amount of money. There was a brief recession from about 1919 to 1921, but this was kind of normal for after World Wars or any type of war. And the problem was simply that we just needed to have the economy go up again, which is what it did. The problem was going to be in the late 20s. So after about 1926, real wages began to stagnate. Major cultural changes that took place. You might remember I talked about modernism versus traditionalism. Well, so what is modernism? Modernism was the belief in science, progress, and a challenge to old ways, challenge to wisdom. There was a good example of this, or something that symbolized it. Charles Lindbergh took the airplane, the Spirit of St. Louis, and flew from New York to France without once having to refuel. For that time period, that was a huge innovation. That was a challenge to nature's rules. And at the time, Charles Lindbergh looked like this young model. And so he came across as sort of a symbol of youth culture. Another good example of modernism was swing dancing. I know, that's just fun. What does that matter? It's symbolic. Swing dancing was different from traditional dancing. In order to do swing dancing well, you had to be innovative. You had to be emotional. And yes, this will be important, pardon me, I apologize, sexual as well. That's actually going to be extremely important for this time period. In fact, that gets into the next thing. A lot of parents moved out to suburbs and they had more money, so they sent their kids off to boarding schools to get a better chance at education. What happens when you get a whole bunch of young people together in the same place without too much parental supervision? Yeah, this is where you get a lot of challenges that were taking place at that time period. So, women began challenging traditional roles as well. Women challenged roles with a group called the Flapper Girls. The Flapper Girls were these girls who got in public with short cut hair. They had loose dresses, they would dance swing music, and they would smoke in public. Now, to them, honestly, these young girls, they were just having fun. But it was a challenge to traditional roles for women. No longer was this strict line between the public and private sector. Now, you might think, wow, feminists must have loved this. No, not really. One of the young suffragettes at the time, probably the most radical, was a woman named Alice Paul. She actually led the movement to get women the right to vote. She criticized Flapper Girls from a feminist point of view, claiming that the Flapper Girls had sort of demeaned the whole idea of being a feminist by really just going after what was fun and what was, a thrill for the moment. African Americans also challenged their roles. At the time, African Americans had been moving out of the South in huge numbers, called the Great Migration, which took place about from the 1890s up till 1970. When they got up into the North, one of the biggest movements that took place was in the Harlem Renaissance. There, black people congregated together in a city to support one another, and they started developing new types of poetry and dance and music and art. Now, in some cases, some of the leaders at the time disagreed with the African Americans themselves. W.B. Du Bois said there wasn't enough political engagement by these new artists. Marcus Garvey, who lived in Harlem, called for a Back to Africa movement. He made the argument that white people were never going to give up their power. The only way black people could actually have their identity was to go back to Africa. But the Harlem Renaissance thinkers argued that actually not only were white people being racist, but actually Marcus Garvey and W.B. Du Bois were fitting into a type of racism. This type of racism pigeonholed black people and said that black people were either subservient, like what the KKK argued, or just out for political activism. Harlem Renaissance thinkers said African Americans were humans. They were much more than this. They were dramatic, they were artistic, they were creative. They were, in other words, human. And African Americans who were part of the Harlem Renaissance argued, we haven't won in politics. We haven't won with this whole self-help movement from Booker T. Washington. What's the biggest racist argument made against us? That somehow we lack culture. That Africa lacks culture. And yet here we are in Harlem, changing all the rules. It's our art that will change everything. There's another group of people, in this case young white people, called the Lost Generation. And they criticized both urbanization and suburbanization. They said that there was a form of conformity taking place. Now you might notice this is similar to transcendentalists. They called for rugged individuals who would challenge the past, challenge traditionalism. Well, that leads into our traditionalists, and yes, there were many. The traditionalists generally came from religious conservatives, especially Christian conservatives. They feared the loss of strict rules, the loss of sexual morality. But there were other traditionalists as well. For example, the KKK. They feared incoming immigrants, especially from Southern and Eastern Europe. In fact, they were going to win a major law in 1921 called the Emergency Quota Act. The Emergency Quota Act said that we would have specific quotas set back in 1873. By 1873. Because that was right before all the new immigrants started coming. So by setting specific quotas from that time period, they were in essence limiting any people coming in from Southern and Eastern Europe. In fact, the KKK did a major march on Washington at this time. There were similar types of events that took place because of this, like the Palmer raids. Attorney General Palmer at the time had this overriding fear of incoming communists and anarchists from Eastern and Southern Europe, and so he led raids in what was known as the First Red Scare against Eastern and Southern immigrants. Woodrow Wilson, the president at the time, well, he showed a movie called The Birth of a Nation in the White House. So what is The Birth of a Nation? The Birth of a Nation was a movie that made the argument that after the Civil War, the South really just wanted to get along. And what really caused the failure was a bunch of radical abolitionists and radical Republicans who came into the South, forced racial equality on the South too quickly, and allowed for a lot of African Americans who weren't really quite ready yet to govern to be in charge. And then on top of all of that, the end of The Birth of a Nation has the KKK riding in as basically heroes, just trying to protect people in the South. They're just a bunch of good old boys. Last off for traditionalists was the Scopes monkey trial. So what is this? Well, in Tennessee, there was a man named Scopes, John Scopes, and he was teaching about evolution. Now, this was no accident. The ACLU had actually asked him to do this. He taught about it. The case was taken to trial, and what the trial was about was whether or not you could teach evolution in the schools. Now, eventually, this case came to court, and it was a famous case because it was done over the radio. Two very important people were in it. On the prosecution side was William Jennings Bryan. On the defense side was Clarence Darrow. And at one point, Clarence Darrow did something very strange. He called for William Jennings Bryan to the stand, and there he questioned him about the Bible. He basically asked him at one point, how is it possible in Genesis that you could have light and dark, and yet you don't have the sun and the moon until about the fourth day in creation? Well, by the end of this entire trial, Clarence Darrow made William Jennings Bryan look pretty foolish. Now, in the end, the trial was actually found in favor of William Jennings Bryan. But in the public's eye, Clarence Darrow had won the trial. This was a major defeat for traditionalists. Okay, so eventually, how did the economy collapse? Well, like I had said, throughout the 1920s, the economy was booming. And in about 1928, the Federal Reserve, our major national bank, feared that because of the rise in the stock market, there might be enough money that people might start buying up gold stocks. So they raised interest rates, or prices on gold. This led investors to seek out gold elsewhere, where interest rates were lower, such as in Britain. That led to a major collapse in the market in 1928. Now, you might think that that was beating the Great Depression. It wasn't. There was a way to stop that problem from happening. The Federal Reserve should have flooded the banks with more gold, but they feared inflation. So the economy hit a major recession in 1930. The government tried to solve this by balancing the budget. That wasn't a smart idea. In fact, the budget, because it was so low at the time, the economy was so low, went completely out of whack. So in 1932, the government raised taxes with something called the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which was meant to protect farmers. Instead, it just caused a major international tariff war and deepened the Great Depression. Now, at the time, from 1928 to 1932, the president was Herbert Hoover. He was somewhat laissez-faire, but not completely. He called for voluntary associations, but Hoover also created something called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which gave out loans to businesses to try to get them going. He also created major public works projects like the Hoover Dam. None of this really worked. What are our takeaways? First of all, the end of World War I left the globe in a very precarious political space, without international collaboration, but the economy boomed due to technological innovations and new financial investments. Number 2. Economic success created the foundation for a fight between modernists and traditionalists over the roles for women, minorities, and immigrants. Number 3. The Great Depression occurred due to this unstable debt grown throughout the 1920s and the poor response of the Federal Reserve. Okay, I'll see you in class.